Yes, okay, I can hear myself. We're very glad to present to you today our MIRIA doc. It's the 10th. It's a thematical report which will be published in January, so you all get a small sneak preview of the content. As you can see, it's about transit migration. I think you all heard about the term in the past. We will make it more clear in our presentation. Belgium on the road to the United Kingdom. What will we talk about? We'll first present MIRIA for those who don't know us yet. We'll talk about our methodology, how we worked, and our working definition, because we found there was a lack of definition, so we needed to create one ourselves. We'll discuss the profile of the transit migrant in Belgium. We'll contextualize the phenomenon in a broader context, not only Belgium, but all Western Europe. We'll also talk about the human rights at stake, the unaccompanied minors as an even more vulnerable group in the group of transit migrants. We'll make the link with smuggling of human beings, and then we'll conclude and shortly, very briefly, talk about the MIRIA recommendations on transit migration. So before we start talking about transit migration, the 3 legal missions of MIRIA, first we inform the authorities about migration flows. We protect the fundamental rights of migrants, and we promote the fight against trafficking and smuggling of human beings. I think these 3 missions really come forward in this MIRIA doc. We talk about the migration flow, the transit migration as such, the fundamental rights of these migrants, and we'll focus on smuggling of human beings, and we won't really talk about the trafficking in this presentation.
So I'll elaborate a bit on the methodology we used. So first we started with some desk research, as transit migration is a phenomenon that has existed for ages in especially Europe, and in recent years also in the US. Then we went to meet several key actors in Belgium that work with transit migrants, which I will talk about more a little bit later. We also talked to some transit migrants themselves. We asked the government bodies that have data on transit migrants to share these with us, so we can show how the population of transit migrants is, what type of people they are, their gender, etc. This has been difficult, but because, of course, transit migrants themselves, they don't want to acquire legal status in Belgium, so they try to avoid contact with the authorities in general. Then some groups within the transit migrants are even more underground, let's say. For example, we saw the tragedy in Essex, where the Vietnamese transit migrants were discovered in a truck. And these don't really show up in our interception statistics that we got from the immigration office. So the immigration office didn't have information on individual transit migrants that they encountered. So we only have an idea of how many people were arrested, but not individual people. So it means that, for example, certain people were arrested over 10 times, so they show up in the statistics over and over again. So we feel that there is insufficient monitoring of the population. Okay, so here you can see an overview, a quick overview of who we encountered. So we met with the immigration office, the different police departments, the guardianship service, also NGOs, volunteers, and transit migrants in the park and in the humanitarian hub. So, like Nina said before, we developed a working definition on transit migrants in Belgium, because usually the definition that is used by the different authorities is not uniform. They all have their own way of describing them, which then leads to incoherence between these authorities, and that way it's very difficult to estimate whether we are talking about the same people and Therefore, Miria thought it was useful to develop a definition. So to us, a transit migrant in Belgium is the third country national, usually in irregular stay, who is in transit through Belgium with the aim of establishing him or herself in the United Kingdom and who initially has no intention of settling in Belgium. Certain groups do stay in Belgium for a long time because they don't succeed at arriving in the UK.
So even though the data was insufficient, we yet tried to make a profile of the transit migrant in Belgium. Our findings are that they are mostly Eritrean, Sudanese, and Iraqi, mainly male. However, we talked to the humanitarian hub, which is a hub in Brussels, which provides services to transit migrants. And they witnessed that if they have more facilities for women, such as a specific room only for women, that more women show up. So in the data of the immigration office, there is no gender specifics, but we see that they are mainly male. However, there are women transit migrants as well. They're very young. The group is 17 to 25 years old. We'll talk about non-accompanied minors afterwards, since it is a significant group of the transit migrants in Belgium. The group is really diverse in terms of administrative situation. For example, some claimed asylum in Italy or on their way in Germany. Some had a decision, a positive one, were a recognized refugee on their way to Belgium. Some didn't wait for a decision. Some don't even know if they got a decision or not. Some didn't claim asylum, and so on. The means and ways of traveling are very diverse as well. Some transit migrants are quite wealthy, and sometimes they rely upon smuggling networks to go to the UK. Some don't have any money at all and try to do it themselves. We see that they try to climb into trucks on parking lots on motorways. They do it themselves, they organize themselves, they take the train and they look for parkings next to the motorway, or they ask a friend if they know a parking lot where they could try, or there are some parkings where who are mainly from smuggling networks, so they need to pay to try and get into trucks there. Some make their own boats and try to cross the canal. Some try to swim the canal. Very sad story in the newspaper of an Iraqi man. The place of departure and residence is very different as well. Some try in Belgium next to the motorway, some try in Brussels next to a bus, some try in Zeebrugge. It's a main spot as well. They stay in Brussels, for example, Parc Maximilien, but also in homeless shelters. Portulis is in Brussels. It's a main homeless shelter, where the biggest part of the group who stays there are transit migrants. They stay with host families, sometimes safe houses if they're relying upon smuggling networks. Some stay in camps in the north of France, and they commute. I think it's clear that a transit migrant isn't static. They move around. They try where they can. Here are some figures we based ourselves upon to make this conclusion. On the left, you see the arrests that were made on transit migration, specifically in 2019 until July. So the main group, Eritrean, Sudanese, Iraq. As said before, Elisabeth explained already, so these numbers, it's not the number of the present transit migrants in Belgium, but it's the amount of arrests, administrative arrests. So it's really hard to really deduct the profile of the transit migrant. However, the findings were confirmed by all the NGOs for example, in Brussels, but also in Zeebrugge. However, we see at the coast that there is Iran, which doesn't show up that much in our statistics, but so Iranese people, same for the Vietnamese, for example, in the Essex case, they're not represented in these graphs. On the right, you see same for 2019 until July. The percentage that declared themselves minor when they were arrested. So we can tell Eritreans, Sudanese, Ethiopians are quite young, because it's a large percentage that says they're minor when they encounter the police. Vietnam isn't on our graph, but because there is less arrests of Vietnamese, but half of the Vietnamese that were intercepted through transit migration declared themselves minor. So there as well, minority is a big caution. We need to put the phenomenon on a bigger scale, of course. It's not just a Belgian phenomenon. On this map, you see the main ports. In the south, you see Bilbao and Santander. You might ask yourselves why we put Spain on the map. It's because we have some statistics of the UK arrivals, irregular arrivals, that show that there are people leaving from Santander and Bilbao as well. Then you have the main ports in France. Of course, Calais, Dunkirk are very important ports to go to the UK. Belgium has Zeebrugge, and then in the Netherlands we have Hoek van Holland, Hook of Holland, where they also encounter transit migrants trying to go to the UK. In our Myriadoc, our report, we included the perspectives of these countries as well. They have a contribution on the phenomenon, which is very interesting to read. So it's a specific situation, Belgium, UK, however comparable to France, the Netherlands and Spain. The UK as a destination country, it's known that the UK is very attractive to migrants. In our report, we try to go into the details about why it is attractive and if it is really that attractive as we sometimes think. Belgium as a transit country, we just saw the map. The geographical location is one of the main reasons. Regional cooperation between the UK and Belgium is an important, is very important to Belgium as well, to France mainly. Calais and Dover really work together. The UK border force invests a lot in Calais. Like it's personnel, it's staff members for security control of the ports, but also they provide drones to do checks in the port. Belgium also is asked, they asked the question again to the UK for further cooperation to tackle the issue.
In our encounters with several actors in the field, we noticed that many human rights of transit migrants are at stake. I will only go into a few because our time here is limited. With regard to the right to human dignity and the right to information, we can say that mostly civil society and volunteers ensure that the basic needs of transit migrants are met. So, like Nina said, there is a humanitarian hub and Portuguese and Sisters House for female transit migrants. And there they can, in the humanitarian hub, they get information, they can have tracing by the Red Cross, they can call their families, and they have urgent medical care as well. We feel that it is very important for the migrant to have agency and to be able to make a decision on their future, that their basic needs are met. And just in general, it's important that their right to human dignity is respected. With regard to the right to freedom and the prohibition of torture, I will first present a few numbers to give a bit of a framework on how this is all happening. So in general, we see that in recent years, the number of administrative arrests have increased constantly, and the proportion of transit migration arrests has also increased. So in 2014, for example, 8% of the administrative arrest was in the framework of transit migration, which last year it was 35%. We see specifically that Eritreans get arrested administratively in the framework of transit migration much more often in recent years. And Syrians, on the other hand, we see that there is a huge decrease. the arrests are, of course, made by the police, and after this, the immigration office has to make a decision and decide how they will proceed. They can release the person, they can give them an order to leave the country, they can detain them, and if they're minors or declared minors, they it is confirmed that they are minors, they can also be released for this reason. We see that since the policy change in 2018, the number of detention decisions has almost tripled, while it was quite stable the years before. This is due to the policy change. There were a few new types of decisions introduced, especially in the framework of the Dublin regulation. And also the political actors thought it was much more important to try to give a good follow-up to the detention, to the arrests by the police. We do see that many more declared minors are released because of their age, which is a bit worrying. A few years ago it was 14%, 2018 we see it's 25%. Then we have some numbers on removals. These are not removals of transit migrants, but these are removals in general of people let's say the top nationalities in transit migration. We see that no Eritreans have been returned to their country of origin in 2018. We also see the numbers are very low for Sudanese people. So in general, we can say that in the people that are most often seen in the transit migration numbers, that they are rarely actually returned to their country of origin, and most of their removals are in the framework of the Dublin regulation. So in our interaction with actors in the field, we noticed that very often the transit migrants were arrested, detained, and then released again, which in our opinion, is in violation sometimes of the right to freedom, because people should only be detained generally if there is an actual perspective of removal in short term. Sometimes people that were detained, there was no confirmation of their nationality or their identity, and this then causes them to be detained without there being any view of removal. And as we said, there is very few removal to country of origin because of the risk of the prohibition of torture to be violated in that case. These people, like, for example, from Eritrea have a high protection need. For example, in 2018, 92% of Eritreans that applied for international protection was granted the status. So we see that actually they have high protection need, and even though they don't always apply for asylum here, they still do have this protection need. So maybe a more comprehensive policy should be developed to guarantee that their rights are guaranteed.
So as we already said, there are a lot of young transit migrants. This certainly requires extra attention for their vulnerability. We saw there were a lot of arrests also of minors that were then released, of course. But still, we visited detention centers where minors are detained. Then they get an age test because the social assistant has a doubt about the age. But this means that the minor has been detained for some time until there is an age test with the result. So there is certainly a need for extra attention from the police, but also all the other authorities that encounter the transit migrants. We see that once they arrive, so when the police knows it's a minor, they will bring them to an observation orientation center of FedAsyl. But we see that the disappearance numbers are really high from these centers. The minors leave the center sometimes within 3 days before a guardian has been assigned to the minor. However, there is insufficient data to really know how long they stay. are the people who leave, is it the transit unaccompanied minors? Where do they come from? Is it boys, girls? The data is insufficient. So there should be a different approach for these young minors that have lived on their own within groups with friends. Sometimes they try, we talk to some transit migrants, they try to go to UK 5 times a week. They take the train, they try to climb into trucks. In the weekend, they rest with a host family, their Belgian family. But when they arrive in this kind of observation center, they have to hand in their phone. They cannot have contact with the outside world. This is a black and white difference between how they lived before and how they have to live in the center. So in this, we also stress the best interest of the child. And then it's also important to make the link with smuggling of human beings. There is an intrinsic link between transit migration and the smuggling of human beings. Myria publishes yearly reports on trafficking and smuggling of human beings. So our report is quite brief on this subject. However, here you see the statistics on the persons that were arrested in the port of Zeebrugge, I don't know if it's the right translation, where there was a suspicion of smuggling. So it's possible that the real smuggling victims are higher than these numbers or lower, but in these cases there was a suspicion. So the numbers aren't really high, but might be interesting. In 2016 and 2018, the Iraqi and Iran nationals were the highest, the top 2. Even though Iran, we don't see them in our interception statistics as we saw earlier. However, in Zeebrugge, the volunteers confirmed that there are a lot of transit migrants from Iran. Eritrea was one of the main nationalities in 2017, and in 2019, Albania and Turkey were the top 2. Also a lot of transit migrants that had it's declared nationality, so you can never be sure. As shown that in the statistics, there are a lot of EU nationals that were intercepted in the port of Zeebrugge who say they are from the UK or other EU countries.
So in short, Myria understands, of course, that and emphasizes that migration management is important, but that this should be with respect for fundamental rights of migrants in question. We have a few recommendations that we make in the Myria doc, so we recommend that you also read the Myria doc. Quickly, we can say that we think that better monitoring should be implemented, that it should be possible to identify how many individual transit migrants are around. We also think that the humanitarian hub or similar hubs should be financed by the government to ensure that the basic need of transit migrants are met. In these hubs, the staff should be trained to be able to identify possible smugglers of human beings that are trying to infiltrate, because this risk is always high where migrants meet that are still looking to go to the UK. Like Nina said, the unaccompanied minors run away very often from the centers where they're put after they are arrested, and we think that they should be better protected. Their guardians should be trained in a way to really try to connect with the minors much more, even though they are not always willing themselves. We also think that the sovereignty clause in the Dublin regulation that was mentioned also this morning should be applied more broadly, in the sense that especially for vulnerable migrants, instead rather than having them run around the EU a lot, maybe Belgium should more often treat their asylum requests when they're eventually done. We also, in the Myria doc, we developed a bit on the Article 77 of the Immigration Act, which is about the penalization of help with aid to irregular immigration, which is not punishable if it is mostly for humanitarian reasons. And Miria thinks this should be clarified because sometimes it can lead to intimidation of volunteers that hand out sleeping bags. So we think that it's important that it's clear with what type of acts are included. So this was our presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nina and Elizabeth, for introducing us to this work that has not been published yet.